The wind, a relentless sculptor of dust and despair, had carved Eliza's journey into the barren plains, each gust a whisper of the life she'd fled, each sunrise a stark reminder of her solitude. She arrived at the ragged edge of the lava beds, a place where the earth itself seemed to hold its breath, twisted and scarred like a forgotten wound, not as a hopeful pioneer, but as a fugitive from hunger's cruel decree. The offer of work had been a rough-hewn signpost in a desolate land, a scrawled promise of food and shelter in exchange for cooking for a band of Modoc warriors, men spoken of in hushed, fearful tones in the settlement she'd skirted, phantoms of the wilderness. Yet, fear was a luxury she could no longer afford, starvation was a more immediate, more tangible beast. Her earthly possessions were a threadbare shawl that did little to ward off the chill that seeped from the volcanic rock, and a small, dented tin pot, a relic of a gentler past. The camp, when she finally stumbled upon it, was less a settlement and more an embodiment of defiance, a scatter of rudimentary shelters clinging to the unforgiving landscape like stubborn lichen. Smoke, thin and acrid, curled into the grey sky, the only soft line in a panorama of jagged edges. Warriors, their faces etched with the same harshness as the terrain, watched her approach, their eyes dark, unreadable pools reflecting the vast, indifferent sky. Silence, thick as cold river mud, enveloped her, broken only by the sibilant whisper of the wind through sparse, tenacious grasses. One man, taller than the others, his presence a palpable weight even in stillness, stepped forward. His gaze was not overtly hostile, but it was a thoroughfare for scrutiny, missing nothing of her weariness, her ill-concealed fear, the desperate hope flickering like a dying ember in her eyes. He was not adorned with the overt symbols of leadership she might have expected, yet an undeniable authority radiated from him, as subtle and pervasive as the scent of sagebrush after rain. His hair, black as a raven's wing, was bound simply, his clothes practical, worn, yet there was a certain way he held himself, a rootedness to the earth that spoke of deep connection and unwavering resolve. This was Cale, though she did not know him by any name then, only as the silent arbiter of her immediate fate. He gave a curt nod, a gesture so minimal it was almost swallowed by the enormity of the landscape, yet it was permission, an acceptance as stark and unadorned as the camp itself. Another warrior grunted, gesturing towards a crude lean-to that would be her domain. It was little more than a collection of scavenged planks and hides, offering scant protection against the elements, but to Eliza, it was a reprieve from the open, a fragile bastion against the encroaching night. Cale turned away without a word, but later, as the sun bled its last colors onto the western horizon, she found a small pile of precious firewood and a skin of water placed near her shelter, an unspoken provision, a silent acknowledgement of her arrival, and perhaps, a flicker of something other than indifference in the heart of this desolate, guarded place. She sank to the ground, the weariness a physical ache in her bones, the silence of these men a heavy blanket. Her past was a relentless pursuer, a shadow that stretched long even in this remote sanctuary, but for now, the immediate terror of starvation had receded, replaced by the gnawing uncertainty of what this new, precarious existence among the legendary, feared Modoc would bring. She was an outsider, a woman alone, her future as inscrutable as the faces of the men who now held her fragile destiny in their calloused hands. The taste of dust was on her tongue, the scent of wood smoke in her hair, and a profound sense of displacement settled deep within her, a seed of isolation that she feared would take root and consume her entirely. Days bled into one another, each dawn painted with the same stark palette of grey rock and pale sky, each nightfall bringing a chill that settled deep into Eliza's bones, a chill the meagre fire in her cooking pit fought a losing battle against. Her life became a rhythm of small, essential tasks, coaxing flames from damp kindling, stirring pots of thin stew made from whatever game the hunters brought back, scrubbing pans with sand and icy water until her fingers were raw and numb. The warriors remained distant, specters flitting at the periphery of her awareness, their voices rare, guttural sounds that conveyed little to her beyond their immediate needs. They ate in silence, their eyes constantly scanning the desolate horizon, their watchfulness a palpable tension that never eased. She learned not to meet their gazes directly, to move quietly, to make herself as unobtrusive as the grey lizards that skittered among the rocks. Yet, amidst this pervasive mistrust, a subtle pattern began to emerge, woven into the fabric of her harsh existence by the silent man she knew only as Cale. He rarely spoke to her, a grunt of acknowledgement for his portion of food, a fleeting glance that seemed to catalogue her state without expression, yet his presence was a constant. When the wind, sharp as shattered glass, threatened to rip the tattered hide covering her lean-to, she would find it mysteriously resecured with new thongs. On mornings when the water skin was nearly empty, a full one would appear before she had to make the arduous trek to the spring. Once, a younger warrior, emboldened by drink or arrogance, had approached her shelter after dark, his shadow falling long and menacing across her doorway. Before she could even voice the fear that constricted her throat, Cale had materialized from the deeper darkness, a figure of silent warning. No words were exchanged, but the younger man had recoiled as if struck, melting back into the night, and Cale's shadow had lingered for a moment longer, a protective sentinel, before he too disappeared. Eliza did not understand him. His face, lean and weathered, was a mask, revealing nothing of the thoughts that moved behind his dark, penetrating eyes. He was one of them, a warrior hardened by a life she could scarcely imagine, yet these small, almost imperceptible acts of consideration were like tiny, scattered embers in the frozen landscape of her fear. She found herself watching him, cataloguing his movements, the way he carried himself with a quiet assurance that belied the austerity of his appearance. He moved with the grace of a predator, yet his hands, when he accepted the bowl of food from her, were steady, their touch surprisingly gentle on the warm wood. She began to leave a slightly larger portion for him, a morsel of carefully hoarded dried fruit tucked beside his bread if she had any, a silent acknowledgement of his silent guardianship. He never acknowledged these small offerings, yet she knew he noticed. The trust between them was not a bridge built, but a single, fragile thread spun across a chasm of silence and suspicion, strengthened by these unspoken exchanges. Her past still haunted her dreams, the faces of those who had wronged her, the echoes of accusations, but here, in this brutal, untamed land, under the watchful eyes of these formidable men, a strange sense of security, fragile as it was, began to take root. It was not safety, not in any conventional sense, but a feeling that the immediate, chaotic dangers of her previous life had been replaced by a more predictable, if still perilous, order. And Cale, the silent enigma, was somehow at the center of that emerging order, a fixed point in her otherwise spinning world. Her hands, chapped and sore, continued their work, but her spirit, so long battered, found a strange solace in the rhythm, in the necessity of her role, a quiet dignity in providing sustenance in a place where survival was a daily, hard-won victory. The fragile equilibrium of Eliza's existence shattered on a day the sky wept a cold, relentless rain, turning the dusty camp into a morass of mud and misery. A group of riders, not Modoc, but grim-faced white men from a nearby settlement, armed and belligerent, had approached the camp's perimeter, their voices loud and laced with accusation, demanding the return of allegedly stolen livestock. Fear, cold and familiar, coiled in Eliza's stomach as she huddled by her sputtering fire, straining to hear the exchange. The Modoc warriors had formed a silent, unyielding line, and then Cale had stepped forward. It was not his movement that startled her, but the sudden, sharp deference shown by the other warriors, the way they parted for him, their expressions hardening into something fiercely loyal. And then he spoke, not in the sparse grunt she was accustomed to, but in clear, decisive English, his voice carrying a resonant authority that cut through the bluster of the accusers. He was not Cale, the quiet warrior, he was a leader, a commander, his words measured, firm, denying the theft but offering no concession to their aggression. Eliza watched, a stunned realization dawning, as he negotiated, his gaze unwavering, his stance that of a man accustomed to bearing immense responsibility. The settlers, outnumbered and faced with an unshakable resolve, eventually retreated, grumbling threats. It was only later, when a younger warrior, one who occasionally offered her a curt nod, spoke his name with a mixture of reverence and concern. "Kinpush has saved us from bloodshed today, but they will be back," that the full weight of Cale's identity crashed down upon her. Kinpush. Captain Jack. The name was legend, whispered with fear and awe, the leader of this defiant band, a man hunted, a man who carried the survival of his people on his shoulders. The firewood he'd left for her, the water skin replenished, the shadow that had shielded her, these acts were not just from a fellow outcast, but from the very heart of the Modoc resistance. A new, more profound fear mingled with a confusing surge of something akin to gratitude, but also betrayal. Had he deliberately deceived her? Or was his silence merely a part of the immense burden he carried? The knowledge recast everything. His quietness was not just temperament, but the heavy mantle of leadership in perilous times. The lines of worry etched around his eyes spoke of sleepless nights spent planning, strategizing, not just for the camp's provisions, but for the very existence of his tribe. The pressure on the Modoc was intensifying. Whispers of army movements, of settlers encroaching further onto their ancestral lands, were a constant, anxious hum beneath the surface of daily life. Eliza felt the shift in the camp's atmosphere, a heightened tension, a more pronounced vigilance. Her own position felt even more precarious. Was she a liability? A white woman in a camp of warriors increasingly targeted by her own kind. One evening, as she was banking the fire, Kintpush approached her. He stood for a long moment, the silence stretching between them, no longer the comfortable quiet of shared solitude, but one freighted with unspoken questions. "You know who I am," he stated, his voice low, not a question but an acknowledgement. Eliza could only nod, her throat tight. "It changes nothing of your work here," he continued, his gaze holding hers, searching. "You are safe here." As safe as any of us can be, his words, meant to reassure, instead highlighted the fragility of their sanctuary. A test of her fragile, nascent trust came sooner than she expected. A scout returned, breathless, with news of soldiers massing not far off, preparing for what seemed an inevitable assault. Panic, a wild, frantic bird, beat its wings within her. She could flee, try to melt back into the landscape, perhaps even seek out the soldiers and claim to be a captive. The thought, shameful and swift, was a bitter taste in her mouth. But then she saw Kintpush, his face a mask of grim resolve, conferring with his warriors, his hand resting briefly on the shoulder of a young boy who looked at him with utter faith. She saw the weariness in him, the terrible weight of his decisions. And she remembered the firewood, the water, the silent protection. Betrayal was a poison she had tasted before, she would not be its purveyor. She stayed, her fear a cold knot, but her decision a quiet anchor. She would face whatever came, here, with these people who had, in their own harsh way, offered her a refuge. The attack came not with the dawn's hesitant light, but under the bruised purple of a sky not yet surrendered to morning, a brutal cacophony of rifle fire and shouted commands tearing through the fragile peace. The soldiers, a relentless blue wave, surged towards the Modoc's stronghold, their numbers a terrifying testament to the forces arrayed against Kintpush and his people. Eliza, jolted from a fitful sleep, found herself in a maelstrom of desperate activity. Warriors, their faces grim, snatched up weapons, their movements economical and precise, born of long anticipation. The air filled with the acrid scent of gunpowder, the screams of the wounded, the earth trembling under the impact of hooves and falling bodies. Kintpush was everywhere, a figure of stark command amidst the chaos, his voice a rallying cry, directing his men, his presence a bulwark against the encroaching tide of violence. He moved with a lethal grace, his rifle speaking in sharp, deadly bursts, yet his eyes, when they fleetingly met Eliza's across the smoke-filled camp, held a profound, almost unbearable sorrow. She was no warrior, her hands more accustomed to kneading dough than wielding weapons, but a desperate need to act, to contribute, to somehow shield these people who had become her unwilling protectors, surged through her. The wounded were being brought to a sheltered alcove in the rocks, their cries muted by pain and the stoicism of their kind. She saw a young warrior, barely a man, his leg bleeding profusely, his face pale. Without a second thought, Eliza tore strips from her own petticoat, her movements urgent, remembering skills her mother had taught her long ago, skills for mending cloth, now repurposed for mending flesh. She pressed the makeshift bandages against the wound, her touch surprisingly steady, her voice a low murmur of comfort she hadn't known she possessed. Kintpush, orchestrating a fighting retreat to a more defensible position within the labyrinthine lava beds, saw her. For a fleeting second, his gaze locked with hers over the chaos, and in that instant, something profound passed between them, an understanding, a recognition that transcended the violence surrounding them. He saw not just the cook, the outsider, but a woman of quiet courage, her fear submerged beneath a wave of fierce compassion. He gave a sharp order to two warriors, who, despite the raging battle, moved to her side, providing cover as she tended to another injured man. The battle raged for hours, a desperate, uneven struggle. The Modoc fought with the ferocity of cornered wolves, using their intimate knowledge of the terrain to their advantage, but the soldiers were relentless, their numbers overwhelming. Eliza, her dress stained with blood, her face smudged with soot, continued her work, a small beacon of aid in the heart of the storm. At one point, a stray bullet ricocheted off the rock above her head, showering her with stone splinters. Before she could react, Kintpush was there, shoving her roughly to the ground, his body momentarily shielding hers as another volley of shots rang out. "Stay down," he yelled, his voice raw, before whirling back into the fight. The warmth of his hand, the fleeting pressure of his body against hers, lingered, a stark contrast to the cold terror that gripped her. As the day wore on, and the soldiers, having sustained heavy casualties themselves, began a grudging, temporary withdrawal to regroup, a fragile quiet descended. Kintpush, his face etched with exhaustion and grief, surveyed the devastation. His people had held, but the cost was high. He found Eliza sitting beside a warrior she had bandaged, her shoulders slumped, her hands trembling now that the immediate adrenaline had faded. He knelt beside her, the leader vanishing for a moment, replaced by the man. He reached out, his calloused fingers gently brushing a streak of grime from her cheek. No words were spoken. None were needed. In the crucible of battle, their silent bond had been forged anew, tempered by shared danger, by her unexpected bravery, by his instinctive protection. The mistrust was burned away, leaving a raw, undeniable connection, a shared understanding of survival, of loss, and of the courage found in the darkest of hours. He had seen her strength, and she had seen the humanity beneath the warrior's hardened exterior. They were no longer just leader and cook, outcast and outcast, they were two souls who had faced the abyss and found, in each other, a reason to keep fighting. The aftermath of the battle was a landscape of sorrow and resilience. The lava beds, once a refuge, now bore the fresh scars of conflict, a somber testament to the price of defiance. Kintpush led his depleted band deeper into the wilderness, seeking a place where the tendrils of the encroaching world might not so easily reach, a place where they might heal, however slowly. The dead were mourned with a quiet, profound grief that settled over the survivors like the cold mountain mist. Eliza, now an intrinsic part of their small, battered community, moved among them, her presence no longer that of an outsider, but of one who had shared their crucible. Her hands, once soft, now bore the roughness of toil and the faint, fading stains of her battlefield ministrations, symbols of her transformation. Kintpush, too, was changed. The weight of leadership remained, heavy and unyielding, but in his eyes, when they rested on Eliza, there was a softness, a warmth that had not been there before. The silence between them was no longer one of caution or uncertainty, but of deep, unspoken communion. They found their sanctuary in a hidden valley, sheltered by towering peaks, where a clear stream whispered secrets to the ancient pines and the earth was fertile enough to sustain them. It was not an ending, but a new, fragile beginning. Together, with the remaining Modoc, they began to build, not just shelters of stone and timber, but a semblance of peace, a life wrested from the ashes of war and displacement. Kintpush, though still the leader, often worked alongside his people, his hands helping to raise the simple dwellings, his gaze constantly watchful, yet now also holding a measure of weary contentment. Eliza established a true hearth, a place of warmth and nourishment that became the quiet heart of their small settlement. She planted a tiny garden with seeds carefully hoarded, coaxing life from the rich soil, each sprouting green shoot a tiny flag of hope. A rough-hewn cabin, slightly apart from the others, became theirs, a shared space where the burdens of his leadership and the echoes of her past could, for a few precious hours each night, be laid aside. There, in the flickering firelight, he would sometimes speak, not of battles or strategy, but of the old ways, of the spirits of the mountains and the rivers, his voice low and resonant, weaving a tapestry of belonging that slowly, tenderly, began to include her. She, in turn, would sometimes read to him from a battered book she had managed to salvage, her voice a soothing balm to his tired spirit. Their life was not easy. The shadow of the outside world still loomed, a distant threat, and the grief for what was lost would always be a part of them. But in this hidden valley, they found a measure of solace, a hard-won peace. Their love, born in hardship and nurtured by quiet acts of courage and kindness, was a resilient bloom in a harsh landscape, a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit to find connection even in the most desolate of circumstances. It was a quiet love, undemonstrative yet profound, built on a foundation of mutual respect and a shared journey through darkness into a fragile, cherished light. The valley became their home, their sanctuary, a place where the echoes of Kinpusha's war cries softened into the murmur of the stream, and Eliza's fear gave way to the quiet strength of belonging. Their shared silence was now a language of the heart, understood more deeply than any words. In the vast, often unforgiving tapestry of life, where shadows of the past loom large and the path forward seems obscured by hardship, we find stories like Eliza's and Kinpusha's. Theirs is a journey that speaks to the quiet courage that resides within us, the resilience that allows us to endure, and the unexpected places where solace and connection can be found. It reminds us that trust is not always given freely, but earned through deeds, through silent understanding, through the unwavering protection of another's fragile hope. It teaches us that even in the deepest desolation, the human heart can find a way to bloom, that love can bridge the divides of culture, experience, and fear, forging a bond stronger than any adversity. Their story is a whisper of hope, a testament to the power of redemption, and the enduring search for peace, not as a destination, but as a shelter built, hand in hand, against the storms. If their journey through the wilderness of the heart has touched yours, if you believe in the strength found in quiet dignity and the redemption found in selfless protection, then we invite you to become part of our community. Subscribe to our channel for more tales of courage, resilience, and the enduring power of the human spirit. Let these stories be a light for your own path, a reminder that even in the darkest of nights, hope can be found, and love, in its myriad forms, can be the ultimate sanctuary. Join us, and let us continue to explore the landscapes of the heart together.